This incident is from a secluded, multi-generational plantation property surrounded by weeping willows in Beaufort, South Carolina. In the Deep South, there is a very old, very dark superstition: you must never leave pieces of yourself behind. Hair from your brush, a clipped fingernail, a drop of blood, these are anchors. If the wrong person finds them, they can weave a bridge that allows something rotting, angry, and dead to walk right into your home. My name is Harper. And this is the terrifying true story of how my careless mistake nearly cost me my sanity and the life of my infant son. The nightmare began when David and I brought our newborn son, Noah, back to his family's massive estate in Beaufort. Noah was the firstborn son of the new generation. While my mother-in-law, Eleanor, was ecstatic, my sister-in-law, Clara, was not. Clara had been married for 10 years and could never conceive. Whenever she looked at my baby, her smile never reached her eyes. There was a cold, hollow resentment in her stare that made my skin crawl. But I was too exhausted to worry about family politics. Postpartum fatigue had hit me like a freight train, and with it came severe hair loss. Every time I brushed my hair, thick, red clumps would fall out. I was so tired that I would just carelessly leave the tangled hair sitting on the bathroom vanity, completely ignoring Eleanor's frantic warnings to throw it away or burn it. The haunting started exactly 1 week later. It was 2 a.m. The South Carolina heat was oppressive, but as I sat in the nursery rocking Noah to sleep, the ambient hum of the air conditioning suddenly died. The air in the room grew instantly, unnaturally freezing. My breath began to plume into white fog in the dark. Then, I heard it. Slap, squelch, slap. It was the wet, distinct sound of bare footsteps walking up the drywall. Not the floor, the wall. I froze, clutching Noah to my chest. The sound moved straight across the ceiling, stopping directly above the rocking chair. A thick, putrid smell flooded the room, smelling like an open grave and dried copper. Something wet dripped onto my shoulder. I slowly tilted my head back. Clinging to the plaster ceiling like a crushed insect was a woman. She wore a tattered, rotting funeral dress. Her limbs were bent at agonizing, broken angles. But her face, dear God, her face! Her jaw was completely unhinged, hanging down to her collarbone. Where her eyes should have been, there were only deep, black, hollow sockets. And from those empty voids, thick, coagulated black blood wept endlessly, dripping down onto my nightgown. I let out a blood-curdling scream. The ghost's head snapped toward me, emitting a deafening, metallic shriek, and she lunged down from the ceiling, her jagged, overgrown fingernails reaching directly for my baby. I threw myself to the floor just as David burst into the room and flipped on the lights. The ceiling was empty. But on my shoulder, soaking into the fabric of my clothes, was a thick, black stain of putrefied blood. The next 2 weeks were a descent into psychological hell. David refused to believe me. He looked at the black stain and called it oxidized baby formula. He told me the ghost was a hallucination caused by severe postpartum depression. Clara was even worse. She would stand at the end of the hallway, watching me with her arms crossed, whispering to Eleanor about how unstable and dangerous I was becoming. But the ghost didn't care if they believed. She was getting stronger, and she was determined to take my child. The climax of their gaslighting happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had put Noah down for a nap in his crib and went downstairs to make coffee. I wasn't gone for more than 5 minutes. When I walked back upstairs, the hallway was freezing. I sprinted to the nursery. The door was wide open, and Noah's crib was completely empty. "David!" I screamed, my vocal cords tearing. "David, he's gone." She took him. The entire house erupted into chaos. As I hyperventilated and tore apart the closets, a faint, muffled crying echoed from the end of the hall. David ran to the heavy wooden door of the uninsulated attic and threw it open. Noah was lying on the freezing, dust-covered floorboards, inches away from the open, 3-story drop of the attic window. "Oh my God," David breathed, scooping Noah up. He turned to me, his eyes filled with sheer horror and disgust. "Harper, you carried him up here. You almost threw our son out of a window. You're losing your mind." I didn't. I wailed, falling to my knees. The weeping woman took him. They didn't listen. They locked me in the first-floor guest bedroom and heavily medicated me with sedatives. They took my baby away. Clara eagerly volunteered to move Noah into her room to keep him safe. I lay in the dark, a prisoner in my own home, sobbing until my throat bled. But that night, the sedatives couldn't stop what was coming. The locked door slowly creaked open, and the sickening smell of rotting earth flooded the room. The weeping ghost glided into the bedroom, hovering an inch above the floor. She crawled onto the foot of the bed, dragging her rotting body up my legs until her hollow face was inches from mine. She opened her unhinged jaw, and a raspy, demonic whisper echoed in my skull. "The knot is tied. The hair is bound. He is mine tonight." She dissolved into a cloud of freezing black mist, shooting straight up through the ceiling toward Clara's room on the second floor. Adrenaline and pure maternal rage finally shattered the sedatives. I forced my heavy body off the bed and stumbled out into the hallway. I ran into the foyer just as the front doors burst open. It was Eleanor, accompanied by Father Thomas, an old-school Catholic demonologist from a local parish. Eleanor had seen the black blood. She knew it was a curse. "Where is it?" Father Thomas yelled, his voice booming. "Upstairs." I screamed. "She's going after my baby." We charged up the stairs. The entire second floor was engulfed in a freezing fog. We hit Clara's door, it was locked, and Clara was inside, screaming in absolute, bloody terror. Father Thomas kicked the door with the force of a battering ram, splintering the lock. The scene inside was pure carnage. The weeping ghost was levitating in the center of the room, holding Clara by the throat. Her jagged nails were digging deep into Clara's neck, drawing streams of bright red blood. Noah was in the bassinet, wailing loudly, untouched but terrified. "In the name of Jesus Christ, release her." Father Thomas roared, hurling a vial of holy water directly at the entity. The water struck the ghost's rotting face, hissing like acid. The ghost shrieked, dropping Clara, and turned her bleeding eyes toward the priest. "She is bound to this house." Father Thomas yelled over the screeching wind. "Harper, find the anchor." Someone summoned her. "Find your hair." I looked at Clara, who was gasping for air on the floor. Her terrified eyes darted frantically toward her heavy oak vanity mirror. I sprinted toward the vanity, yanked the bottom drawer entirely out, and dumped it onto the floor. Amidst the makeup, a small, dark object rolled onto the carpet. It was a voodoo doll. But it wasn't made of cloth. It was a grotesque, miniature effigy woven entirely out of thick, red human hair, my hair. The hair I had carelessly left on the bathroom counter. It was bound tightly with black twine, wrapped in grave dirt, and pierced with a rusted iron nail. The ghost saw what I was holding. She abandoned the priest and lunged across the room, her unhinged jaw opening to bite my face off. I ducked, rolled across the floor, and shoved the hair doll directly against the searing hot halogen bulb of Clara's vanity lamp. The intense heat instantly ignited the dried hair. The reaction was explosive. The doll erupted in a violent flash of blinding, emerald green fire. The weeping ghost froze midair, letting out a scream that shattered the vanity mirror into 1,000 pieces. As the doll burned to black ash in my hands, the ghost's physical form violently caught fire. She thrashed in absolute agony, her form imploding inward until she dissolved completely into a foul-smelling cloud of smoke that was sucked out the broken window. The freezing temperature vanished. I ran to the bassinet and snatched my baby up, sobbing uncontrollably. On the floor, Clara began to convulse. When a curse is broken, the dark energy rebounds violently onto the caster. Clara's eyes rolled back, white foam bubbling at her lips as she tore at her own hair, her mind completely shattered by the magical backlash of her own twisted jealousy. Clara was institutionalized the very next day, diagnosed with severe, permanent schizophrenia. David finally saw the truth, and we moved far away from that suffocating estate. Noah is safe now. But I never leave a single strand of hair in my brush. I sweep the floor every day, gather every loose piece of myself, and burn it to ash. Because the dark is always watching, and if you leave pieces of yourself behind, you are just giving the devil a key to your front door. This incident is from a sprawling, heavily wooded, and isolated colonial estate situated deep in the freezing, snowbound valleys of Sleepy Hollow, New York. They say that when two people unite in marriage, it brings light, prosperity, and the promise of a beautiful future into a home. But no one ever warns you about the shadows that light can cast. No one tells you that an ancient, malicious envy can use the sacred bond of marriage to invite pure evil right across your welcome mat. Some spirits do not cross over when they die. They linger in the spaces between our world and the next, chained by their own obsessive hatred, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My name is Anna. And this is the true story of how my brother's wedding brought a deadly curse into our family home. The nightmare began the night my older brother, Richard, brought his new bride, Sarah, back to our family estate in Sleepy Hollow, New York. It was late December, and the winter was absolutely brutal that year. A massive blizzard had buried the dense pine forest surrounding our property in 3 feet of snow, effectively cutting us off from the rest of the world. The wind howled against the heavy glass windows of our colonial home like a dying animal. My younger brother, Ben, and I had spent the entire week decorating the house, making it warm and perfect for the newlyweds. When Richard's SUV finally pushed through the icy driveway, we were ecstatic. We spent the evening sitting by the roaring fire in the living room, drinking hot cider and unpacking the mountain of wedding gifts they had brought back from the reception. "Look at this one, Anna," Sarah whispered, pulling a small, dark wooden box from the bottom of the pile. There was no tag, no card, and no return address. Inside the velvet-lined box rested a heavy, antique silver bracelet studded with jagged, pitch-black obsidian stones. It looked incredibly old. It looked primal. And it looked completely out of place among the fine china and crystal glasses. "I don't remember who gave us this," Sarah said, a strange, almost hypnotic, distant tone entering her voice. Slowly, she lifted the heavy silver medal and slipped it onto her right wrist. The exact moment the clasp clicked shut, the temperature in the massive living room plummeted. It wasn't just a sudden winter draft, the air turned instantly, violently freezing, plunging to sub-zero temperatures. I could suddenly see my breath pluming in thick white clouds in the air. The heavy glass light bulbs in the antique chandelier above us flickered violently, glowing a sickly green for a fraction of a second, before they all blew out simultaneously with a deafening pop. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Just a blown fuse from the storm. Richard yelled over the sudden, heavy silence, trying desperately to sound rational. "Ben, go check the breaker box in the basement." While Richard fumbled with his phone flashlight, I looked over at my new sister-in-law. My blood ran ice cold. Sarah was standing in the dead center of the room. Her back was completely rigid, her posture unnaturally stiff, like a wooden board. But it was her eyes that terrified me. Her warm, beautiful hazel eyes were gone. They were completely rolled back into her head, exposing nothing but bloodshot, pulsing white sclera. "Sarah, are you okay?" I gasped, grabbing her shoulders. She blinked rapidly, and her eyes instantly returned to normal. She looked at me, completely confused, the hypnotic trance broken. "I'm fine, Anna." "Why?" "I just feel a little cold." I tried to brush it off as exhaustion from the wedding and the storm, but that night, the house truly turned against us. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. It was coming from the second-floor hallway. Scrape. Scrape, scrape. It sounded like bone or hard stone dragging against the wooden floorboards. I crept out of my bedroom, shivering in the freezing air. The hallway was completely dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the frosted window pane. Sarah was walking down the hall, sleepwalking. But her movements were jerky, disjointed, and heavy, like a broken marionette being pulled by invisible strings. As she walked, she dragged her right hand along the expensive floral wallpaper. I gasped, clamping a hand tightly over my mouth. Sarah's fingernails, which had been perfectly short and manicured hours ago, were now impossibly long, yellowed, and jagged, curled like the talons of a bird of prey. She was carving deep, violent gouges right through the drywall, leaving 5 distinct, bleeding scratches in the plaster. I ran to her, grabbing her arm. "Sarah, wake up." Her head snapped toward me at an impossible, broken angle. Her mouth opened, but the voice that came out was not hers. It was a deep, raspy, echoing growl that vibrated through my very bones, smelling of sulfur and ash. He belongs to me in the dark. And then, she simply collapsed into my arms, dead asleep. By the third day, the air inside our home was physically heavy, thick with the nauseating stench of copper, rotten eggs, and spoiled meat. We were completely trapped in the blizzard, the roads impassable. Richard aggressively refused to acknowledge the supernatural, claiming Sarah was just suffering from extreme sleepwalking and severe stress. But the terror was escalating far too fast for logic to explain. It started in the kitchen. I went down to make breakfast and found our heavy refrigerator door hanging wide open. Every single piece of food inside was completely putrefied. The fresh vegetables were covered in a thick layer of writhing black maggots. But the most horrifying thing was the milk. Inside the clear plastic jugs, the white liquid had coagulated into a thick, pitch-black sludge. The true physical horror struck that afternoon. Ben was taking a shower in the upstairs bathroom. I was in the hallway when I heard him let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream that shook the entire house. "Ben!" I shrieked, sprinting to the door. It was locked from the inside. "Richard! Help me! Hurry!" Richard came running up the stairs. Together, we threw our combined weight against the heavy oak door. The wood splintered around the lock, and the door flew open. The bathroom was a literal slaughterhouse. The thick glass shower doors were completely shattered into 1,000 pieces. Ben was backed into the corner of the tile wall, completely naked, sobbing in sheer, unadulterated agony. The water pouring out of the showerhead wasn't water. It was boiling, steaming, jet-black sludge. It was pooling on the floor, bubbling and hissing. But that wasn't what had been screaming. His back and chest were covered in vicious, deep, actively bleeding claw marks. The exact same 5-finger gouges I had seen Sarah carving into the hallway walls. "Something is in here." Ben sobbed hysterically, sliding down the bloody tiles, hyperventilating. A woman. She was burnt. Her skin was completely black and peeling off her skull. She came right out of the drain and grabbed me. Richard's face went completely pale. The rational architect finally saw the truth staring him in the face. While Richard frantically bandaged Ben's wounds, I tore through the house, desperately searching for answers. I knew enough about the occult to know that black magic requires a physical anchor. In the dark, freezing basement, hidden behind the old, rusting furnace, I found it. Sitting perfectly arranged in a triangle on the cold concrete floor were 3 grotesque, hand-stitched voodoo dolls. They were made of rotting, wet burlap. One had a piece of my red hair stitched to its head. One had a scrap of Ben's favorite flannel shirt. The third had a piece of Richard's silk wedding tie. Thick, rusted iron nails were driven violently, completely straight through the hearts of the dolls. I called the only person I knew who could help. Father Miller, an old family friend and a priest who studied the dark occult. He braved the tail end of the blizzard in his heavy truck, arriving at our house 2 hours later. The moment Father Miller stepped through the front doors, the heavy silver crucifix around his neck violently snapped off its chain and clattered to the hardwood floor. "This is not a simple haunting," the priest whispered, his eyes wide with genuine fear. refusing to pick up the cross. This is a targeted execution. Someone has anchored a demonic rage to this property. He marched upstairs and stood outside Sarah's bedroom. He pulled a silver pendulum from his coat pocket. The moment he held it near the door, the pendulum spun so violently it nearly tore out of his hand, the metal burning his skin. "The bride is the vessel," Father Miller said grimly. "She is wearing a cursed object. A hex. It is acting as a doorway for a spirit consumed by jealousy and absolute hatred. If we do not destroy the anchor tonight, the spirit will completely devour her soul, and then it will slaughter everyone in this house." I dragged Richard out into the hallway, slamming the rotting voodoo dolls against his chest. "Look at this, Richard. Look at what is happening. Who would do this to us? Who hates you this much?" Richard stared at the dolls. He looked at the deep gouges in the walls. And then he described the dark obsidian bracelet Sarah had worn since the wedding night. His legs completely gave out. He sank to the floor, burying his face in his trembling hands. "It's Cassandra," he sobbed, his voice tearing apart with guilt. "Who is Cassandra?" I demanded, grabbing his collar. Richard confessed his darkest, most closely guarded secret. In college, he had been relentlessly stalked by a girl named Cassandra. She was completely unhinged, deeply involved in the dark occult, and insanely obsessed with him. She claimed they were soulmates bound by blood magic. When Richard finally threatened to get a restraining order, Cassandra snapped. She told him that if she couldn't have him, nobody ever would. That same night, she drove her car into a concrete bridge support at 100 miles an hour. The car exploded on impact. She was trapped inside, burning alive, screaming his name as her skin melted from her bones. "Richard," I said, my voice shaking as the dreadful, sickening truth clicked into place. "Dead girls don't mail wedding gifts. Dead girls don't bury voodoo dolls in our basement. Who brought that bracelet into this house?" Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with pure, paralyzing realization. "Her sister. Danielle. She came to the wedding reception to drop off a gift. She said she wanted to make peace. Danielle hadn't come to make peace. She had come to deliver a death sentence. She had spent years harboring an insane, vengeful grief, and she had used black magic to unleash her sister's burning, furious spirit directly onto Richard's new wife. Before we could even process the horrifying truth of the betrayal, a deafening crash echoed from the first floor. The heavy front doors had been violently kicked open, letting the freezing blizzard hull freely into the foyer. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the upstairs hearth and ran to the landing. Standing in the foyer, covered head to toe in snow, was Danielle. Her face was twisted into a mask of absolute, psychotic rage. Her eyes were completely sunken in, dark bags hanging beneath them like bruised fruit. Fueling this dark magic had drained her own life force. She held a heavy, serrated hunting knife in her hand. "You figured it out, didn't you?" Danielle screamed, her voice echoing unnaturally in the massive house. It sounded like two voices speaking at once, her own, and the raspy, demonic, layered growl of her dead sister. "He let her burn. My sister burned for him. And now, You are all going to burn with her." Suddenly, the solid oak door to the master bedroom behind us exploded off its hinges, sending wood splinters flying like shrapnel. Sarah stepped out into the hallway. But it wasn't Sarah anymore. The possession was entirely complete. Her skin had turned a sickening, charred, ash gray. Deep, glowing red cracks spiderwebbed across her face, like hot coals burning just beneath her skin. The obsidian bracelet on her wrist was glowing with a blinding, violent purple light. The temperature in the hallway skyrocketed. The heat was unbearable, the smell of scorching flesh and sulfur making me violently gag. "Robert," Sarah hissed. The voice was a legion of agonizing, fiery screams. It was Cassandra. "In the name of the Father." Father Miller roared, stepping in front of Richard and holding up his Bible. Sarah let out an ear-piercing, unearthly shriek. With a flick of her charred wrist, an invisible, supernatural force slammed into the priest, throwing him backward down the entire flight of stairs. He hit the bottom landing with a sickening crack and didn't move. "You have to get the bracelet, Anna," Richard yelled, tackling the possessed Sarah to the floor. Sarah possessed terrifying, demonic strength. She grabbed my brother by the throat, her jagged, overgrown nails digging deep into his flesh, drawing streams of blood. I didn't hesitate. I charged down the stairs, leaping over the unconscious priest, gripping the iron fire poker tight. Danielle lunged at me with the hunting knife. She slashed wildly, the blade tearing through my heavy wool sweater and slicing a deep, burning gash across my shoulder. Hot pain flared, but pure adrenaline flooded my veins. I swung the heavy iron poker like a baseball bat, catching Danielle directly in the ribs. I heard the bone snap loudly. She shrieked, collapsing onto the hardwood floor, dropping the knife. "Give me the box," Danielle sobbed, spitting blood, grabbing frantically at my ankles. "The magic needs an anchor." I kicked her away, sprinting to the massive stone fireplace in the living room. The fire was roaring, the thick oak logs cracking with intense heat. I looked up at the balcony. Richard was losing his grip. Sarah was choking the life out of him, her charred face grinning a horrific, impossible smile. "Richard, grab her arm," I screamed. Using the absolute last ounce of his strength, Richard pinned Sarah's right arm against the wooden railing. He gripped the silver clasp of the burning hot obsidian bracelet, severely burning his own hands, and violently ripped it off her wrist. He threw it over the balcony. The heavy cursed jewelry plummeted down into the living room. I caught it mid-air. The metal was searing, blistering the skin on my palms instantly. I didn't stop. I turned and threw the bracelet directly into the deepest, hottest part of the blazing fireplace. The reaction was apocalyptic. The flames inside the hearth instantly turned a blinding, violent neon green. The fire erupted outward, shooting a massive pillar of green flame straight up the chimney, shaking the very foundation of the house. Upstairs, the possessed Sarah arched her back, letting out a scream that sounded like tearing metal. A thick, pitch-black smoke forcefully erupted from her mouth, nose, and eyes. The dark cloud swirled aggressively above the balcony, slowly forming the agonizing, screaming face of a severely burned woman, Cassandra. The entity stared down at the fire, screaming in absolute, unadulterated terror as the anchor tying it to our world melted into useless slag. The black smoke violently imploded, vanishing entirely with a concussive shockwave that shattered every window on the first floor. They sold the property at a massive loss and moved across the country, trying to leave the nightmare behind. But the memory of that night is permanently burned into my mind. I am the one who had to scrub the deep, five-finger gouge marks out of the hardwood floors before we sold it. I am the one who still wakes up in a cold sweat. Because I know the truth. True evil doesn't hide under the bed. It doesn't hide in the closet. True evil can be wrapped in a pretty bow, dropped off with a smile, and invited right into your living room. And once you invite the devil inside, it takes a lot more than a locked door to keep him out. This incident is from a weathered, isolated saltbox house surrounded by the dense, fog-choked redwood forests of coastal Northern California. They say time heals all wounds, but whoever coined that phrase never had a child go missing. Time doesn't heal profound trauma, it just lets it fester in the dark. 10 years ago, our 9-year-old daughter, Lily, was abducted on her walk home from elementary school. A white van, a rainy afternoon, and she was gone. My wife, Evelyn, broke in a way that no therapy could fix. She treated our living son, Sam, like a nuisance, pouring all her love into the ghost of a daughter who was never coming back. If you scream into the agonizing darkness for 10 long years, eventually, something in the dark is going to answer you. That answer came on a freezing night in November. A massive Pacific storm was battering the California coastline. I was in the living room when the heavy oak front doors violently blew open, smashing against the drywall. Evelyn stood in the doorway, completely drenched by the freezing rain. But she wasn't alone. Standing right beside her, holding her trembling hand, was a teenage girl. She looked about 19 years old, wearing a filthy, oversized gray hospital gown that clung to her emaciated frame. But it was her face that made the blood freeze in my veins. She had pale, sickly skin, long, tangled black hair, and right beneath her left eye was a small, distinct, crescent-shaped birthmark. "Arthur," Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her face with a manic, terrifying ecstasy. "Look who I found sitting by the bus stop. It's her. It's Lily." I stared at the girl. The bone structure, the raven hair, the crescent birthmark, it matched the police age progression photos perfectly. But my primal instincts were screaming at me to run. This girl was not right. She didn't breathe. Her chest never rose. Her skin wasn't just pale from the cold, it was the waxy, translucent gray of a cadaver. And her eyes were completely bloodshot, the pupils fully dilated, fixed in a 1,000-yard stare of pure, unadulterated agony. There was no life behind them. "Hi, Dad," the girl whispered. Her voice sounded like crushed glass grinding against concrete. It didn't sound like it came from her mouth, it echoed directly inside my own skull. The exact moment she spoke, the temperature in the foyer plummeted below freezing. Our breath turned into thick white fog. A foul, suffocating stench flooded the room. It smelled like stagnant swamp water, rusted iron, and rotting meat. I knew instantly, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that this was not a runaway. My wife had brought something dead over the threshold. Evelyn was completely blinded by her delusion. She locked the doors, disconnected the landline, and moved the girl straight into Lily's untouched childhood bedroom. But the house immediately reacted to the violent, spectral energy of the ghost. Puddles of freezing, muddy water would inexplicably manifest in the hallways. The vintage wallpaper outside Lily's bedroom began to peel and blister, black mold spreading across the drywall in the shape of frantic, clawing handprints. The ghost of my daughter was fiercely, terrifyingly possessive of Evelyn. She had died in absolute terror, crying out for her mother, and now, her spirit was a twisted, jealous force of pure trauma. And she absolutely despised Sam, viewing him as a replacement who had stolen her mother's love. On the third night, the haunting escalated from atmospheric dread to sheer physical violence. I was downstairs when I heard Sam let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream from his bedroom. I sprinted up the stairs and threw open his door. The room was a localized blizzard. Ice crystals were literally forming on the inside of the window panes. Sam was backed into the corner of his bed, sobbing hysterically. Standing at the foot of his bed was Lily. But the illusion of the teenager was rotting away. Her waxy skin was peeling. Her neck was covered in violent, dark purple strangulation marks. Her fingernails were completely torn off, her fingertips bloody and raw, the desperate wounds of a girl who had tried to claw her way out of a concrete tomb. "Get away from him!" I roared, grabbing a wooden baseball bat from the closet. Lily slowly turned her head. The bones in her neck cracked and popped sickeningly. She didn't walk, she hovered an inch above the carpet. Black, putrefied blood began to weep slowly from her hollow eyes. "He took my place," she hissed, her demonic voice vibrating through my teeth. "She forgot me because of him. I spent 10 years in the dark. Now, he goes into the dark." With a sudden flick of her rotting wrist, an invisible force hit me in the chest like a wrecking ball. I was thrown backward through the air, crashing through the solid wooden doorframe and collapsing into the hallway. The door violently slammed shut, and the deadbolt clicked into place on its own. I threw my shoulder against the wood, screaming for my son, until I finally shattered the lock and burst inside. The room was empty. The ghost had vanished into thin air, leaving Sam hiding under the bed, shivering in terror. The next morning, while Evelyn was downstairs, I managed to fix the cut phone line and dialed the police, claiming my wife was holding a runaway hostage. An hour later, Detective Miller stood on my front porch. He was a veteran investigator, but today, he looked pale and deeply shaken. "Arthur," Miller said, his voice grim. "There is no runaway. I came here because we found her. We found Lily." The world stopped spinning. Miller slowly pulled a horrific, blood-stained Polaroid from a manila folder. It was a picture of Lily at 14, locked in a filthy, dark concrete cellar. On the wall behind her, scrawled in her own blood, was a single word repeated endlessly: M-O-M. 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 "The FBI raided a human trafficking compound yesterday," Miller whispered, tears in his eyes. "She died 5 years ago, Arthur. They kept her in the dark. She died screaming for her mother. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping uncontrollably. My daughter had died in agony, and now her traumatized, vengeful ghost was upstairs. A horrific, deafening crash echoed from the second floor. The entire house shook. I shoved past the detective and sprinted up the stairs. The door to Lily's old bedroom was wide open, the hallway covered in a thick, freezing black fog. Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the bed, her lips a frostbitten blue. She was shivering violently, her eyes rolled back in a hypnotic trance. Standing directly over her was the terrifying, rotting ghost of my daughter. Lily was holding Evelyn's hand, literally freezing her to death, draining the life force straight out of her body to drag her into the afterlife. "Evelyn, she is dead," I screamed. "Lily, please. You are killing her." Lily let out a deafening, unearthly shriek that shattered the bedroom window. She lunged at me, her freezing, skeletal hands wrapping around my throat. She lifted me off the ground with supernatural strength, my windpipe crushing under her grip. Suddenly, a small, terrified voice cut through the howling wind. "Mommy." Sam was standing in the doorway, clutching his teddy bear. He looked at Evelyn, who was slowly dying on the bed, and let out a heartbreaking wail. "Mommy, please don't leave me. I need you. Please, Mommy, wake up." Lily froze. Her rotting fingers loosened their grip on my throat. I dropped to the floor, gasping for air. The vengeful spirit slowly turned her head to look at Sam. For 10 long years, Lily's spirit had been trapped in a continuous, agonizing loop of her own death, screaming for a mother who never came. But as she watched her little brother crying out for his mother in the exact same desperate way, the loop broke. She realized that if she murdered Evelyn, she would be damning Sam to the exact same horrifying abandonment she had suffered. The violent, freezing wind in the room died instantly. Lily fully released Evelyn's hand and glided across the floor, stopping right in front of Sam. The terrifying, rotting visage of the murdered teenager slowly faded, replaced by a soft, glowing white light. For a brief, heartbreaking second, she looked like the beautiful, innocent 9-year-old girl we had lost all those years ago. She reached out and gently touched Sam's cheek. It didn't burn him. "I'm sorry," her voice echoed, now a soft, infinitely sad whisper. "Take care of her for me." With a heavy sigh that smelled of fresh rain, Lily's spirit dissolved entirely into the air. She had made the ultimate sacrifice. To save her brother from a life of grief, she chose to walk into the dark afterlife completely alone. Evelyn gasped violently, sucking in a massive breath as the freezing aura left her body. The hypnotic trance was broken. For the first time in 9 years, she looked at Sam and saw a terrified little boy who needed her. She crawled across the floor and wrapped him in a fiercely protective embrace, weeping and begging for forgiveness. We moved out of Northern California 2 weeks later, desperate to leave the trauma behind. It took years of intensive grief counseling, but Evelyn finally learned to let go of the ghost and be a mother to the son who was still living. My daughter came back to us as a nightmare. But she left as a protector.